Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and what you can see in front of me is my little green tub, and in the green tub are A and C stands for African nightcrawlers, or at least so I was told when I got the cocoons that these little guys hatched from more than 400 days ago, I believe at this point. This bin has been going for 111 days now, and a week ago, on day 104, after it had received what I believe to be 10 feedings over the course of those 104 days, I decided it was looking pretty good, that the material in the bin was beginning to mature really nicely, and that it would be time to try to migrate the worms out of the finished castings so that they could be scooped out and relocated and that the castings could be harvested. So to try to make that happen, I fed the bin, but I didn't really treat that as one of the typical feedings. It's a slightly special form of feeding that I refer to as horizontal migration feeding. And over here on the edge of the bin, where you can see a little bit of plastic covering things up, is where the feeding occurred. And the rest of the bin is just covered up with a little bit of newspaper. So let's get a closer look. I'm going to be resetting the food in here just to make sure that that horizontal migration continues. And to make that happen, I've got a tray with some different foods. Foods such as a banana peel, an old bruised, dried up apple, some coffee, as well as the filter that the coffee was in, as well as just this soiled piece of paper towel. The filter and the paper towel are going to go in as bedding, the rest of it's going in as food. And the food is really meant to keep the migration of the worms going, just in case the food supply is running a little bit low. So let's get a little bit closer so you can see what's happening here. It was in another bin of mine not too long ago that I had gone through the same process of migrating the worms out of the finished castings, trying to simply get them to voluntarily leave so that I can scoop the castings out. And that bin went through a very similar timeline as this one, where the bin had composted normally for about 100 or so days, and then it took about a month or so over multiple replenishments of the feeding zone on the edge of the bin to convince all the worms to exit the material and make their way over onto the edge of the bin, pretty much leaving the rest of the castings worm free, making it very easy to simply empty the container and put the castings into storage. Now you can see a piece of cardboard that I had laid in here as sort of a, I guess, sort of a boundary for myself to be able to more easily see where the finished castings had been pushed over to make room for this feeding here. And it seems like the cardboard's still holding up pretty good. The cardboard was perforated with a bunch of little holes to allow worms to move through it readily. And I just like to see it there so that I've got a better sense of where the feeding zone had been placed previously to help me get a better sense of where the finished castings end and where the feeding zone begins. So now we've got a similar setup to what we bought down here today with the coffee filter from this feeding that we put in here previously. A lot of the coffee that was laid in here is still on top. This feeding seems to be doing pretty good, but it doesn't matter. I still want to reinforce it with some additional food. In the previous situation where I did a similar migration, the food supply in the horizontal migration feeding zone had been replenished, I believe, 3 times. I had gone through, I believe, 2 or 3 replenishments of the feeding zone, after which I had gone in there and removed as many worms that had made their way over into the feeding zone. And then I totally reset the feeding zone, and then I gave it another dozen or so days. And then I extracted that next round of worms that made their way over into the feeding zone. And at that point I had more or less deemed the castings to have been depopulated. And that's the way I was able to harvest my last completed composting bin in approximately a month's time. So So now this is a slightly smaller bin, making me wonder if maybe it'll happen in a slightly shorter period of time, but I really don't know. So you can see there's a fair number of worms hanging out here in this horizontal migration feeding zone. Sorry if I'm repeating it. I know that some people think it sounds a little bit ridiculous, so sometimes I just repeat it because it does sound rather ridiculous. I like to hear myself saying it for some reason. And a lot of the items in this feeding zone are food items that would normally take a fair amount of time to break down, such as these corn cob bits. Corn cob bits, I guess, are a little bit tougher type material that take longer to break down than other types of foods that might be slightly softer, that might just decompose more readily on their own. So all I'm really looking to do today is just push things aside, and everything that's been working here for a week already, getting broken down gradually, is getting pushed inboard closer to the compost, and setting up space on the very, very far end, as far out of reach for the worms as possible for the new feeding zone. This way, any of the stuff that's been breaking down over here for the greater period of time might actually just end up being part of the finished compost and not being hauled out with the worms when the time comes to relocate the worms. So I'm a little bit cramped for space in this bin. I don't really have that much room to make this sort of thing happen, but I think we've got sufficient room now to proceed. Alright, so I guess we'll just recycle this little piece of coffee filter, and we'll rest it down in the bottom of the feeding zone as bedding. And I've also got this other piece of paper we can do the same with. Put that stuff right underneath where the food's going to go. And then we'll do the same thing as we did before. We're going to use coffee to cover things up here to try to make this food a little bit more submerged underneath the coffee, because the coffee, I believe, does a good job masking the smell of things that might have the potential to attract insects, like these pieces of apple. So as you can see, there's sufficient food in here probably to allow this migration to just continue unaided. But I did find that it worked so well last time that I did think that the 3 or 4, I believe it was actually 4, the 4 feedings that were applied periodically to the horizontal migration feeding zone over the course of approximately a month's time produced such good results that I thought I would just kind of stick to it, where I guess the average period of time between replenishments of that was about a week. So it's been a week exactly now. So if on a weekly basis I keep coming in here and replenishing the feeding zone, I think we'll get similar and hopefully as good results as we did with the last bin that we did this in. So I'm wondering if a little bit more bedding in here might help, because I did set aside a piece of newspaper for this, sitting over here on the side. I just thought maybe a little bit of something over there on top of the foods, in addition to the coffee that I'll be sprinkling on top, just to help mask the scent of the foods. And the bedding always, is a good thing for the worms too. I think that really looks like a nice feeding zone there. And I guess in goes the coffee. Or you know what? Why don't we spread some of this stuff that was already in here on top of that, so we could use this coffee to actually cover everything up. Not bad. It does seem like we've slightly increased the size of the feeding zone here as a result of what we've done. I was just curious about why this worm has not retreated into the material despite the bright lights overhead. Hopefully the little guy's okay. So I kind of like the idea of having a piece of coffee filter here on the top as sort of an additional layer of cover. And the next go around we'll probably have another one that we could use, so this one will just go into the bottom as bedding. But for now this will also sort of sit here as a little bit of an extra additional vapor barrier to try to keep the moisture recirculating here in the feeding area, while we leave the rest of the bin relatively uncovered, only with that sheet of newspaper on top to promote ongoing drying and aeration of the material. Probably more for drying because it is a little bit damp still. But before we get things covered up here, because we're almost done now, I just want to see how the castings themselves look. And in a way, I guess you could even think of that as probably the better thing to start with usually, is to actually see if the worms are still populating the castings, because then if they're all moved out already, it seems like a waste of time to reset the feeding zone to try to migrate more worms out if there's no more left to be moved. Let me move this little guy over here instead. But I have a feeling we're not quite there yet after only a week. We're probably going to find a fair number of worms still hanging out in these castings. Wow, there's one. But I gotta admit, I did expect to see quite a bit more. So here right on the very edge of where the feeding zone was, you could see them kind of congregating there, sensing the added moisture resulting from the food being placed in there, as well as the lure of the scent of the food that was put in there. So it does make sense for us to find more of them over on that edge. The fact that we picked down into here and we saw only one or two is a pretty good sign. That's typically the way it'll begin, I guess. The worms in the compost will sense that the material they're inhabiting is running a little bit low on food, so they'll go foraging for a better, more ample supply of food to dig into. You know, pretty much leaving the finished castings behind and trying to locate greener pastures. So it would be reasonable to expect fewer worms out here on the very, very far edge. And the material's got a really nice consistency to it, even though when I first stick my fingers into it and it compresses like this into a little ball of mud, it does flake apart pretty readily, maybe not quite as readily as I'd like it to. So this is also usually a good opportunity to try to lift up some of the more damp castings from the very bottom of the bin and bring them to the surface to allow them to shed a little bit of their moisture, helping the overall moisture level in the material to come down a little bit and be less damp. By being less damp, we can more readily screen it, should we choose to screen it in the end. A lot of times I don't bother. By also letting it get a little bit more dry, it becomes less of an appealing place for the worms to be, hopefully motivating some of them to exit and go looking for something a little nicer, a little bit more damp. But yeah, their castings are really, really nice. Really nice bin of castings here. Here and there I'm finding little scraps of bedding and food items that were scattered throughout the material. Little chunks of corn. I did sort of stir a lot of the foods that had been in the bin around into the material. And I did attempt to try to round them up last time so that I can use them for building the feeding zone over there on the edge. But it makes sense that I probably didn't find all of it. And every time I find a little piece of food like that, I always think to myself, well, that's a perfectly good reason for the worms to stay in the material, stay there feeding on that piece of food. So if I find something, I typically like to move it over and put it over where I want the worms to be. So besides inspecting the material and trying to see where our migration is progressing to, we also get a chance to recirculate the material a little bit to get the more damp stuff up near the surface and let the drier stuff mix down into the more damp stuff, helping to equalize things. And it also gives us an opportunity to pick out any straggler pieces of food that really belong over in the feeding area. But I think we're pretty much done here. Things look really nice. I'm hoping that we have a similar result to my last migration like this, where the worms did seem to depopulate the material in less than a month. Since we've got a slightly smaller container here, I don't see why that couldn't happen here too. But we'll see. There's so many variables that can influence how that plays out that you know, you can only guess at how long it might take. But we're definitely seeing nice progress here, so I can't complain, that's for sure. Here's a little tiny baby worm. Alright, so very nice. Let's get things packed up here and back up on the shelf. Let these little guys get back to work. So, I guess that's it. I got a little bit of cleaning up and putting things away to take care of, but I'm not going to take your time with that. We're more or less done here, so let me take this as a quick chance to say thank you. Thanks for sticking around and keeping me company. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That always helps so much for the channel, and also consider subscribing to the channel too. If you ring the bell, then you'll be notified of new videos when they come out. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.